It is 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. So welcome to the Kansas Junior Livestock Show Lead Challenge. My name is Brittany Grother, and I serve on the Lead Challenge competition planning team. Thank you for joining us for our third Listen and Learn session tonight. Before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping items to go over. First, I'm sure that most of us are familiar with Zoom meetings at this point, but I'd like to remind everyone to please remain muted during our presentation tonight. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. There will also be time at the end of the presentation to unmute yourself and ask questions. Secondly, please make sure you fill out the participation survey after each session to receive your participation points. The participation survey will ask your name, age division, and one question about what you learned tonight. The survey links are located on the KJLS website. So today's session is titled Kansas's Largest Economic Sector, Agriculture. Our presenter tonight is Tori Laird, who serves as the economist at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I will now turn it over to Tori for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Brittany. And it's so wonderful to see you all tonight. My name is Tori Laird. As Brittany mentioned earlier, I serve as the economist as the Kansas Department of Agriculture. What that means in the shortest way possible is that I answer a lot of questions all day, mostly tied to how does supply and demand and the agricultural economy work in Kansas. But first, before I get talking about a little bit about Kansas, I want to talk a little bit about how I got here. So I'll see if my presentation is going to work for me today. There we go. So in a couple of pictures, I just kind of want to go through my journey of how I came here to Kansas and working at the KDA. So first of all, I actually did not grow up in an agriculture background initially. My parents were business people and had no clue what livestock or crops looked like. But at the age of 6, I decided that I wanted chickens. And what started with chickens kind of spiraled out of control into a very big menagerie of various farm animals of all shapes and sizes. But my first love is poultry. And so I raised rare breed poultry from when I was about 6 years old until I was in high school and college. During that time, I was heavily involved in 4-H and an FFA in California, where I grew up. And I did not plan on agriculture becoming my job description, but for some way crazy form, I was lucky enough to go to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is an agriculture teaching college in the central coast of California. From there, I was able to get a bachelor's degree in agribusiness. The philosophy of the college is known as learn by doing. And I did a lot of that. I got a lot of hands-on activities, from measuring crop yields in the middle of the field to being able to do ag policy memos for different agencies and organizations to give them ideas on how our perspectives were. And from there, I went and worked in the wine industry. In California, in the northern part, there's 2 areas that are very famously known. Napa and Sonoma counties produce some of the best grapes in the world, if you ask my opinion, but someone might fight me for that. But my job was actually working on bringing grapes from their vineyards to the wineries where they'd be crushed and made into wine. I did that for about 2 years and then decided I wanted to have a little bit more impact on the world, and ended up coming here to K-State, go Wildcats, and decided to get my master's in ag economics from K-State. I spent about 2 years there before I finally finished out, and I found this position just up the hill at KDA. Decided I wanted to stay in Kansas a little bit longer, so here I am. And with that, I want to talk a little bit more about Kansas agriculture. So my first question, and it's rhetorical, is who is Kansas agriculture? And more often than not, when we think about who is Kansas agriculture, we think about the producers who produce agriculture products. And they come in a lot of different shapes and forms. A producer is a person who grows, raises, or produces an agriculture product for sale. And they can be farmers, they can be ranchers, they can be men or women, old or young. They're people from all walks of life and different backgrounds. Some of them are generational farmers who have been in Kansas for 7, 8 different generations because their great-great-grandfather first started farming the land back in the 1800s. but we also have people that are just starting out as new and beginning farmers who have never seen it before. They grow all different kinds of products of all different shapes and sizes. There's a couple of pictures of some examples on here, but most importantly, some of those farmers are you. Yes, you count as a younger farmer, and we'd love to see you come into your calling in agriculture. But with that, let's talk a little more about what these producers look like. So when we talk about Kansas farms, a lot of people wonder how many of those farms are actually owned by families. 84% of the farms in Kansas are actually owned by families, which is actually a very high percentage compared to the national average. In Kansas, we have almost 100,000 people involved in agriculture, which is a really awesome number to see. The average age of Kansas producers are 58 years old, 58.1 years old to be exact, which is up there in age, but we won't count that against them. And almost 33% are female. The other half, of course, would be male. When we talk about Kansas farms, though, as of 2022, there are over 57,000 farms operating in Kansas. So that goes all the way from northwest corner, all the way down to southwest and Dodge City, Garden City area, to all the way up towards Wichita, and then up here into the northeast, where we are based out of Manhattan. Most of these farms are actually really big. The average farm size in Kansas is 792 acres, so almost 800 acres, which is almost 300 acres more than the national average. So on average as a state, we are much larger farms overall. Kansas has a lot of land and farms. There's over 45.7 million acres of land in Kansas. We rank number 3 in the amount of land that we have in our agriculture production compared to the overall size of the state. Out of that, 29 million is for crops, and the 14 million acres left over are left over for pasture. Anything remaining tends to be left towards woodlands, which if you stand outside in Kansas, you won't see a lot of trees. So that would be why that is. But something I like to talk about is, what is Kansas agriculture? A lot of people think that there's only a very narrow window of what Kansas agriculture looks like. But I think you may be surprised on some of the things that we grow. But some of the most important things we grow end up being our top products by market value. Market value refers to the price of a product multiplied by the total production. So let's take wine grapes for one example, because that's what I used to work in. So for every ton of grapes produced, maybe it went for $1,000. So we multiply that $1,000 by how much production we had in the state. So let's say that there was 10,000 tons of grapes produced. That's a lot for Kansas, but wishful thinking. So that number multiplied would end up being the market value. So when we rank these products, we're going by their market value, which is put out there by USDA NASS. Our number one, of course, is cattle and calves. I'm sure quite a few of you work with your own cattle at home, but I'm sure also quite a few of you work with our second market value, which is grains and oilseeds. So that covers everything from corn, wheat, sorghum, and soybeans. The third largest is also hogs and pigs, which I'm sure quite a few of you work with. Yeah, there you go. Really excited. Hogs and pigs are number 3 for us by market value, followed very closely by milk from cows. So our dairy production is very, very large as well. Rounding out the 5th one is one you might not necessarily expect, which is other crops and hay. Hay is actually very, very important in Kansas. We might not talk a lot about it, but in order to feed all those cattle and calves on the beef side, but then also on the milk side, we need a lot of hay to grow in order to feed them. So it's actually one of our most important crops. But there's a lot more out there that you might not expect. So I have some bubbles here for some of our other important crops. And those include poultry, my favorite, There's chicken out there just for me. Sheep and goats are actually quite important to the Kansas economy. It's rapidly growing. We also talk about farm machinery and equipment manufacturing. So there's quite a few companies based here in Kansas that make tractors and combines and equipment used for harvesting and planting row crops here. And so that's a very important part of our economy here. Another one that most people don't think about is actually specialty crops. Both Brittany and I have a very special place in our hearts for specialty crops because of some of the work that we've done to help producers make sure that that industry is growing. So specialty crops include fruits and vegetables. It includes nuts. It includes, for a fun fact, popcorn and some other crops that you might not necessarily see, but more often than not, they end up on your dinner plate just as close as they were when they came off the ground. Another important product is the meat that our livestock produce. We are one of the top meat producing states in the US. And overall for the US, we are one of the top producing countries in the world for meat. Another one, you'll see kind of that hand that's holding that rock and there's something coming out of it. Might look a little confusing, but that is actually an old version of flour milling. So flour mills are actually very important to our economy as well. They are one of our top producing sectors. So that is actually an old grist stone that's grinding up that grain there to make it into flour. I couldn't find a modern equipment that looked cool, so that was my compromise there. Cotton is very important to our southern half of our state. If you look at a map of Kansas of all of our crops and products, you'll actually see cotton is kind of hanging out on that southern half of the state, and it's rapidly growing. We are expected to have a bumper crop this year. Another one, you'll see that picture of a dog and cat because pet food is one of our top sectors as well. We produce a lot of pet food here. So some of that food that you might feed your home dog and cat might actually be produced right here in the state where you grew up. And finally, last but not least, we have the greenhouse sector. So those are typically covers products that are grown inside a greenhouse or a hoop house. So that could be anything from fruits and veggies that come off of the vine to growing the plants that create those fruits and veggies in all sorts of different landscaping plants that go into your yard. So even the grass that goes in your front yard counts as an agriculture product. With that, I kind of covered what Kansas agriculture is on a wide spectrum. So we went from a really narrow spectrum to a really wide spectrum. But now the question is, what is the impact of Kansas agriculture? Why is it important? Why should people care? If you talk to a lot of people, they might not care about what happens with agriculture. Specifically, they might not even know why Kansas matters. So one of the things that I like to do in my job is I like to talk about why is Kansas agriculture important and why we should pay attention to it. And a lot of people like to know that through dollars and jobs. So one of the reports that I develop is actually looking at what is Kansas agriculture's impact in the overall economy in the US and Kansas. If we took out agriculture, what is that loss to us? Or what does it add to our economy by having it here is another way of thinking about it. So one of the factors that I use to measure it is the total contribution. So that's asking how much total product and agriculture products do we sell to create an economic driver in Kansas? And that comes out to $81 billion. Billion with a B. That's a really big number. And when we talk about how much that is, that also supports people's jobs. So people have to work in order to produce those outputs. So when we talk about agriculture, it supports about 13% of the entire workforce in the state. Most states around the country, only 2% of the agriculture workforce actually works in agriculture. So it's really awesome to see in Kansas how big of an impact it is because it's almost 13% of our entire state. There's also another way I like to look at its impact. So a lot of people think of us just sending our cattle down to Dodge City to be processed, and we never know where it ends up. Or we grow all this grain and we harvest it and send it to the elevator. But what happens to it afterwards? So we might sell it in domestic markets, and we use a lot of it here in domestic markets. Domestic meaning here in the US, here being our home. But we're not just the only country in the world. We work in a much larger global system. So one of the ways I like to look at the overall impact on a global scale. So how do we fit in the big picture of planet Earth? Kansas agriculture actually has a ton of exports. So out of that $81 billion in output that we put out every year, we have a ton of it that comes out each year. This graph in front of you is showing you the total amount of exports that we're putting out between 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and the year 2022. So that was this last year. This last year, we had a record-breaking year. We had $5.4 billion in sales of agriculture products from Kansas that went to other places in the world. So when we talk about an export, we talk about something that is a product that we produce here that we actually send outside of our borders to somewhere else who wants to buy it out there. They, in turn, might send us an import. An import is a product or a good or service that they send to us. So for example, how many, trying to think right now off the top of my head, we like to import certain cheeses. There's some really, really flavorful, funky cheeses out there that some people really like because they smell and taste like dirty socks. And that's appealing to some people, but we don't necessarily make that here in the US. So we actually go and give a call to our friends in France and say, hey, can we have some of that stinky sock cheese? And we give them some money and they send over on a ship or an airplane or a boat, and they send us over a box of stinky cheese, which then you can have on some crackers and enjoy. That's a very random example, but that's the one I have right now off the top of my head. So it's really, really important to our economy, but you might wonder, where do we send some of our own exports and what's going there? So I want to show you a map. I know there's a lot going on, but I'm going to walk through it really slowly and we'll get to questions at the end. But our number one place that we send our agriculture products to is Mexico. Mexico, we have over $2 billion worth of exports going to. So they take a lot of our cereal grains, which that includes wheat and corn. They're a major corn market for us, is what we would call it. Mexico also takes a lot of our soybeans. They like soybeans and sunflowers down there because they use it to feed cattle as well. They also take a lot of our meat and edible offal. So all of those all the beef and pork that we produce here in the state, a lot of it ends up going to Mexico because there's a lot of people down there to feed as well. Our number two market is actually Japan. Japan is a country off the coast of Asia. It's kind of out here on the right side of your screen. They have $700 million worth of exports. The most important thing that goes to them is Kansas beef. They really like our meat there. They also take a little bit of our cereal grains and some miscellaneous edible preps. But they're one of our bigger markets for beef exporting. Canada comes next. Canada, if you look, that number one there is beverages and vinegar. And you're like, what kind of beverages do we produce? Beverages actually covers ethanol, which is a biofuel produced from corn. That we send a lot of ethanol up to Canada because we produce quite a bit of ethanol from the corn that we produce here in Kansas. They also take some of our soybean meal, which is what that residues and waste is. So waste product from when we crush soybeans to make ethanol. But then they also take quite a bit of our meat and edible offal. Finally, I'll run through the other two really quick. South Korea is almost $500 million worth of exports as of last year. They take a lot of meat as well, along with a lot of ethanol and soybean meal as well. You can kind of see how their piece of the pie kind of changes colors as well. China is a really, really big country, and it takes quite a bit of product from the US and Kansas as well. They take a lot of our meat, which is kind of that blue half of the pie, but they also take quite a bit of our soybeans and then our cereal grains. Again, corn, sorghum, and wheat. They're one of our major export markets for sorghum. With that, I am nearing the end of my slides. And so I want to say thank you to all of you for coming here today. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I'm looking forward to your questions. I want to say one final thing, though, is that Kansas agriculture is really important, and we can't let people forget it. So the story that we tell people, whether they're our buddy next door on the bus, whether they're friends that we meet that might not deal with agriculture on a daily basis, or people you might meet from around the world, telling people about your story and telling them how your part in Kansas agriculture as a junior livestock showman or showwoman, how that makes an impact on the future of agriculture. So I'm really excited to hear your questions. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tori. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself, or you can put them in the chat.
I know I saw some excited hands halfway through, so I'm afraid I might have missed your question earlier.
I can ask the first one that I got in a chat. Tori, you mentioned USDA NAS. Can you tell us what that is?
Sorry, I started speaking econ. So USDA NAS stands for the United States Department of Agriculture, National Agriculture Statistics Service. That's a mouthful. Basically, they're a group of people who work for the US government, and they help collect information about agriculture. We actually have one statistician who's someone who studies these numbers here in Kansas. His name is Doug. He's pretty cool if you get the chance to talk with him. And he helps me identify some of the data and information that they produce that I can use for some of these presentations. And so USDA NAS is the short way of how we call their group. They pulled together some of that information that I was able to use for my presentation tonight. Thanks, Brittany.
What species do you sell the most of each year, and do you think that's going to change in the future?
What species do we sell the most of each year? That was your question, Addie? Yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Do you see? And what do you see changing?
Do I see it changing? So our largest species and largest amount of a species that we sell would be beef cattle. Cattle overall, but beef cattle specifically. So your Angus, Hereford, steers and heifers and bulls and cows, those are generally going to be the top agriculture livestock species that we will sell. Do I see that changing in the future? It depends. It depends on a couple different factors. So in order to grow a cow, you have to have food for the cow. So that means we have to grow hay because cows need forages. So can we keep growing alfalfa in the state? Can we keep growing prairie hay, which is blue stem grass, which is another quality feed for cattle? Now, if we want to fatten those cattle up to send them to market, we have to feed them grain. So then can we produce corn? Can we produce sorghum? Can we produce soybeans? Those are three really important grains that go into growing beef. And so if we have the ability to keep growing those, yes. But the other thing you need to grow cattle is water. And water is a really hot topic in Kansas right now. And that's the biggest question of, do we have enough water to grow those? One, to grow the crops to feed the cows, but also do we have enough water to water the cattle themselves? Because they drink a lot of water. Not nearly as much as the crops do, but I think to answer your question, I think cattle are probably going to remain the top species that we sell, but some of that factor has to deal with how much water do we have left in Kansas? I know you guys already heard from Susan Metzger earlier this week. She's really, really cool. And she talked a little bit about water, but water is so important to making sure ag economy continues. And because cattle use so much water, that's going to be the biggest question. Did that answer your question? Okay, cool. That was a very long answer. Go ahead, Laura.
What's the top hog
Hog producer in Kansas?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that information off the top of my head, but I can find out for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I know we saw a lot of them.
We have a couple questions in the chat coming in too. The first question is, what challenges do we face if we still have older farmers and not enough younger farmers?
Ooh, good question. So one of the challenges that we face, if you saw the average age of a producer is 58 years. That's younger than my parents, but still pretty old. And what the challenge that we're going to face is those farmers start aging out. So that means they start getting older and some of them decide to retire. And so they say, you know what, I'm good. I've done enough work. I'm ready to sit back on the front porch and drink some lemonade on a rocking chair. And that's perfectly fine. But the question becomes, who's going to keep going out there and producing those crops, livestock, and other agriculture products that are so important to Kansas and to our rural economies? And excuse me. So that's one of the biggest challenges is finding the next generation of farmers. And so we like to encourage new farmers and young farmers to start looking and thinking when they're your age. Do you want to come back to the farm? Do you want to farm in the future? And we actually have programs in our state to help aid that transition. Because if we have those farmers aging out, but no one younger to come up and replace them, then we deal with the fact that we have land that goes fallow. So it's not planted to a crop one year. And that means we're not producing a lot of product. That means we don't produce a lot of crop. And if we don't produce a lot of crop, that means we don't necessarily produce livestock to eat that crop if it's a feed crop. And if we have less cattle to feed, there'll be less cattle overall. And so we'd probably start seeing our economy shrink, is what they would call it. Our state itself wouldn't necessarily shrink, but the amount of money that we produce every year would shrink.
All right, the next question in the chat is, what will happen if other countries produce what we are giving them? And what would happen to us as a state? Where would that extra food go? So that's an export question.
That's a big question. And that's a question that keeps me up at night. So one of the things we talk about in economics, and I'm going to try and keep it simple here, and Brittany's going to flag me if I start talking too high. But one of the things we talk about is competitive advantage. So competition. So you guys play sports. If you're going up against a different team, that's competition. So competitive advantage. And so an advantage is something that you have a strength in, or you're really good at doing. So in Kansas, we have a competitive advantage because we're really, really good at growing crops on little water, but we're also really, really good at growing some really, really nice livestock overall. Cattle is our top one out there, don't get me wrong, but we're also really good at growing hogs. We're also really good at growing sheep and goats, and poultry is out there as well. We're really good at that. But there's a lot of other countries out there who are really good. So my personal favorite, Brazil, is out there. And they're really, really good at producing soybeans and corn. They can grow a lot of it because they got a lot of water, and they don't have winter. So they're really, really good at growing not only one season like we do, but they can grow 2 seasons. So they can have double the amount of crops on the same amount of land that we do. And so that's been part of the question of Brazil's now come out and is a big exporter in corn and soybeans. So they're taking up some of our market space. So they're selling a lot to China. They're selling a lot to Canada, to Mexico. And the US is over here like, wait, we still grow stuff, come buy from us. And so we have to make sure that we stay competitive. We can stay competitive through our pricing. So we can offer a lower price overall to certain places. So Mexico and Canada, we can generally offer a lower price because they're really, really close to us. So we don't have to pay a lot of money in order to transport our crops from our state of Kansas down to Mexico or up to Canada versus the cost that it takes us to send it to China. So Brazil can't necessarily compete with us against Mexico and Canada on the amount of cost. So that makes us more competitive advantage. But if that changes, so if Brazil gets really, really good at making it very, very cheap to buy their corn and soybeans, then yeah, they can take over the market. Did I answer the question, Brittany, or did I miss another part of it?
I think that covers most of it. So, for example, if a country decided to go with Brazil over the United States, what would we do with that extra food? Well, question, like, where would that go?
Okay, so that's always a big question, and that would be considered food waste, which is one of our greatest problems in the world, in fact. And so there's a couple other things we can do. We can look for other markets. So maybe we start knocking on the doors of people in Africa, African countries or other parts of Asia, and say, hey, we've got some great corn over here. Would you like to buy some of our corn? And we can offer them a stellar deal. If we have a lot of it and we need to get rid of it really fast. We can also look at alternative markets. So if we have a lot of extra corn piled up in the silo, we can call up the local ethanol plant and say, hey, I've got a lot of corn or I've got a lot of soybeans. Soybeans are probably more accurate, but I've got a lot of this stuff. Can you make it into a biofuel? And so they might make it into ethanol. They might make it into biodiesel, which is increasing demand. So we might look at other market sources. So that would be considered an alternative market. Yes? Okay. Any final burning questions?
Yep, we got a couple more in the chat for you.
Okay.
How often do we send our products to different countries?
Every day. Every single day. They might leave Kansas from a rail car. So they might go on a train out from the co-op. They might dump it in these big old giant train cars and send it off to the coast. Or they might go north to our friends in the Canadian. It's a little bit colder up there, so they need a lot of corn, wheat, and soybeans. We might send it on a rail car all the way down south to Mexico. But we might also send it on a ship. So once it gets to the West Coast of California, Oregon, Washington, we might actually put it on a really, really big container ship and put it inside of a box and send it to someone in Japan or China. And we also send them down the Missouri River. So for those of you who have been around Kansas City, you've seen a big, big muddy Missouri River, as it's known. And we actually send a lot of product down that barge down to the port of New Orleans. It's very, very rare, but sometimes we export stuff on a plane. Normally those are really, really small stuff or really, really expensive stuff. And of course, finally, we might also get it out of there on a big old truck. So those big semi trucks that you get to wave at when you're on the I-70, those guys might be moving your agriculture product that you grow in your own backyard.
All right, our next question is, which crop sells the most each year?
Ooh, of course somebody's going to ask me that question. It depends, and it depends on what we're really good at, really good at growing at that year. So this year, I looked at the WASDE report on Tuesday, and that is the World Ag Demand and Supply Estimates. That's a big old report. But basically it tells me in Kansas how much corn, wheat, sorghum, soybeans, and cotton are we expected to grow. And so this year, We're expecting corn to be up. So we're expecting a bigger crop of corn this year. We're expecting soybeans to be down just a little bit. And we're expecting sorghum to be really, really, really high. One thing I can say off the top of my head, because of course, if I had all statistics in my head at all times, I'd probably go crazy. That's a lot of numbers to keep track of. But we are actually the #1 sorghum producing state in the world, in the US, not in the world. But we produce the most sorghum. So it might be safe to say that sorghum is one of our top products, but I'll have to look that up and bring it back to you. How about that? Okay.
All right, the last question we have in the chat is which cattle sells the best for meat production? So I don't know if we have a breakdown by breed, but maybe hide color could be an indication.
Okay. I am not a cattle expert. Again, I hang out with chickens. But generally, Kansas has quite a colorful array of different hides, but black-hided cattle, so that would be your Angus and Angus crosses, and some other fancy breeds sprinkled in there. Those tend to be the highest amount in Kansas. I've stood at Dodge City and I've stood up on the hill up there in the middle of wintertime when it had just snowed and it was all white until I turn around and I look at this miles of feedlots and it's all black. So it was black and white picture. I thought I had gone back into the land of Oz or something, but I literally was quite in the land of Oz. But black-hided cattle seem to be the most in demand because they can meet USDA grade standards. So those are the standards for meat quality that are tested when they are processed at the slaughter plants and meat packing plants. But red-hided cattle are up there as well, but you'll also see some white-hided cattle. And there's actually quite a bit of dairy cattle that go through our meat processing as well. Brittany, did I hit it all?
Yes, there's one question that snuck in that might be up your alley.
Okay.
So which chicken sells the most? So maybe like what breed of chicken for meat, maybe?
Okay, so, well, poultry-wise in Kansas, if we're talking about all species of poultry, we actually grow a lot of turkeys, but not for your Thanksgiving table. We actually grow a lot of turkeys that are used to make more turkeys. So we grow a lot of breeding turkeys here in Kansas. Otherwise, we have quite a few laying chickens. So most of those layers are going to be what's called a leghorn cross. So a leghorn is a breed of chicken from Italy and Spain. They're kind of from the Mediterranean area. They're known for being really, really skinny and having a big old comb on top of their head so they can use heat really, really well. But they're known for producing a lot of eggs each year. But if you're on the other side of the coin, so meat production, which we don't do all that much of here, the south end of the US is much more popular for chickens. We've got what's called a Cornish rock cross. And that is a cross between a Cornish chicken, which is kind of looks like a bulldog. It's kind of got big chunky arms and it kind of walks like this. That one's from England and it's crossed with one of our American breeds, which is called a Plymouth Rock. Some of you might know it as a barred rock. They're kind of stripy most of the time and they're known for making good eggs, but they're also a great meat producing chicken. So those are the two breeds chickens. Did that cover everything in the chat? Did I answer the question?
Yes, I think you answered the chicken question.
Okay.
We have another one in here about hogs.
Okay.
So they're asking the best breed of meat hogs. I know you're not as familiar with hogs either, but they're asking if Berkshire is the best meat hog.
I make no claims to hogs. I can probably call upon my colleague Trace Mulligan, can probably answer that question for you, but I am not ever going to make an assumption on hogs. I have no experience, so I'm going to bow out on that one. I will say my favorite breed of chicken, though, is a Polish chicken because they look like Elvis and they look like I've got a crazy hairdo going on top of their heads. So those are my favorite.
I will chime in real quick on the hog question. So two of the most popular breeds of hogs specific to the meat industry is one is Berkshire. That's more of a niche type of a market. So a lot of purebred Berks are sold for meat. And then Duroc is actually used a lot in the commercial industry. They breed those to great whites, which are your kind of commercial line sows. And so they breed the Durocs to them, and the Duroc is a really good terminal sire. So those are two breeds that are very commonly known in the pork industry.
Everyone give a round of applause for Trace for coming in and saving that question. Thank you, Trace.
You are welcome.
We have a lot of fun here at KDA.
Well, those were all the questions in the chat. I'll give one last call out if anyone has last question. I see Abby unmuted herself.
Do you think that meat or crops is higher selling?
Ooh, good question. If you go by the numbers, beef production is higher than our grain production, but our livestock production wouldn't be possible if we didn't grow the crops to feed the animals. We grow a lot of feed crops here, and if we couldn't grow those, we wouldn't be as good at growing livestock for meat production and egg production and milk production, all those different animal products. So I would say that meat, we probably sell overall dollar amount if we're going by market value. Does that answer your question, Abby? Or do you have more to add?
No, I don't have anything else.
Okay, but did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
All right, anyone else who wants to ask Tori a question? All righty, if not, I just want to give a big thank you to Tori for coming on tonight and sharing with us about the Kansas economy and agriculture and answering all of your guys' questions. I see some claps. And thank you everyone who joined us live tonight to be engaged with Tori. I know she appreciates your engagement with her presentation. That makes it extra special to get to present. So thank you everyone who participated this evening, and for those watching the recording at a later date, please remember to fill out your participation survey for this session to receive your participation points. And also don't forget to sign up for a speech and interview date and time using the link sent through email and also on the KHLS website. So with that, thank you everyone and have a good rest of your evening.